Hi, this is Mwangi Thuita, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast. You're listening to Root of Conflict, a podcast about violent conflict around the world and the people, societies, and policy issues it affects.
In this series, you'll hear from experts and practitioners who conduct research, implement programs, and use data analysis to address some of the most pressing challenges facing our world.
Root of Conflict is produced by UC3P in collaboration with the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts, a research institute housed within the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago.
Hey, this is Sonnet Frisbie.
And I'm Yano.
And we're both currently master's students at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. And today we are joined by Colonel Liam Collins. Colonel Collins is the executive director of the Madison Policy Forum and the Viola Foundation. He's a retired Army Special Forces colonel and former director of the Combating Terrorism Center and Modern War Institute at West Point. We covered two main topics with him. Number one, the measurement revolution in national defense, and number two, cyber warfare in the Russia-Ukraine context.
Americans of the baby boomer generation will remember the nightly enemy kill counts from the Vietnam War, and that ominous feeling during the period that this was not how to measure success. Indeed, some would claim that we didn't even know what success in Vietnam should even look like. Moving forward and looking at the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, Colonel Collins talks about how U.S. forces continue to have challenges in trying to identify measures of effectiveness and what should constitute so-called significant actions. He is on a mission to train military and civilian defense leaders to ask better questions. The surprising solution? Train them to think like statisticians.
We discuss cooperation between practitioners and academics and how that relationship works in an ideal world to further the study of conflict. Who should study what? How does data get shared and analyzed? Then, in the second half of the show, we take advantage of Colonel Collins' expertise on Russian aggression against Ukraine and others to ask about the present and future of hybrid warfare. We'll talk about how this interlaces with information operations and the limitations of cyber warfare.
So, starting off, you recently penned an article for the online journal War on the Rocks with UChicago's very own Ethan Bueno de Mesquita, along with Kristen DeCaires and Jake Shapiro. So the article offered some thoughtful insights on how the defense community is failing to take full advantage of the measurement revolution and thinking about modern conflict. Can you offer some specific examples, maybe some personal ones, where you saw defense leaders making erroneous decisions based on the misuse or misinterpretation of data?
Yeah, if you go back, this has been a problem for a long time. During the Vietnam War, everybody's kind of aware that the dominant metric that they used was the body count, which clearly didn't work. But I would argue, even in Iraq, when we were looking at, counterinsurgency, I think we got a little better. We had a lot more metrics to go with there. But the one that really kind of aggravated me was the one we call SIGAX, right, which was significant activity. And what it measured in terms of significant activity was basically hostile fire incidents. And so just by giving it that name, significant activities, kind of meant that everything else was devalued and gave it extra weight than it probably shouldn't have. So even then, we're biasing one set of data over the others. It probably wasn't the best indicator in terms of what we were trying to accomplish there. And so it's typically, I think, repeatedly problematic in the defense industry or defense community for a variety of reasons.
In particular, the article notes how senior defense leaders are, woefully undertrained in statistics and data analysis, causing them to misinterpret the conflict data and in turn develop counterproductive strategies. But the way you're talking about it also seems to be just a complete misunderstanding of, not just like the data, statistics, or just the conceptual pieces, but also just a misunderstanding of what should be considered significant in conflict.
Right. So part of it is that, and then part of it is they just really haven't had the training and education on that. So most of it's kind of at the tactical operational level, but not really understanding those aspects once they get out of kind of the conventional fight, right? It's real easy, think of like a World War II, right? It's really easy to measure success, right? You just look at where the line is on the map. Where's the line of control? Are you moving closer to Berlin or are you not moving closer to Berlin? It's a lot easier to determine how your performance is, but in most of our modern conflicts, it's not that simple to figure out where you're at. But it's not for lack of trying, right? So organizations are constantly trying to assess their effectiveness, And so what they're doing is often relying on quantitative indicators, right? Some quantitative metric that tell them if they're succeeding or not. But because of a complex world, right, too much information, overwhelming complexity, they're trying to take cognitive shortcuts, right? And so some kind of indicator or a dominant indicator in terms of, right, a strategy. Is this strategy succeeding or failing? And then understanding different cognitive biases that you have, right? If you have 4 or 5 different metrics you can choose, right, that the bias to choose the one that actually tells you your story that you're succeeding. So it's not, there's all these cognitive and psychological aspects that also explain why we're not good at it.
So how prevalent would you say this problem is currently? I mean, within the higher echelons of the defense community, not just military, but also like the civilian defense leaders. I mean, are there any like enlightened leaders or thinkers? Is there like a shift in the way people are thinking about the problem?
I'm not going to name names, but I think, they want to do better. I just think there's the psychological aspects, the lack of education and understanding how to actually get better at it. I'll give you another example. If we look at Ukraine, right, and what if we provide additional, go back to earlier on in the conflict with Ukraine, should we provide more aid to the Ukrainians, right? And so Susan Rice, as a national security advisor, coined this term lethal aid, right? We wouldn't provide lethal aid to the Ukrainians, just non-lethal aid. First, I don't understand lethal or non-lethal aid. After 25 years in the military, it's defensive aid. But second of all, it's like understanding like what is your theory of the world, and then and looking for the evidence that will support. Right, you got to identify what evidence would support the theory or contradict the theory. So if you're thinking of Ukraine, right, that's some argue it's a international relations theory of realism, right? So it's a response. The more we push and NATO's expanded, it's a natural reaction for Russia to push back. So if we give the Ukrainians more aid, well, what are the Russians going to do, right? If we give them javelin weapons, right, a really the state-of-the-art anti-tank weapon, right, the Russian response should be, right, to be more aggressive, right? That's what we'd expect. But if in turn, right, the theory that explains why the Russians are doing why they're being aggressive is more of, right, a cultural explanation, it's Russian imperialism, right, or maybe it's a domestic explanation, right, they want to have, an enemy, well, then providing, this aid is not going to warrant a more drastic response from the Russians, right? Because you don't want to trip into a World War III scenario with the Russians. But if you just kind of assume this is their response without actually testing it, right, then you're conceding, politically your policy options to them. In this case, we gave them, we ultimately gave them javelin missiles. And the rhetoric at the beginning of, in 2016 was like, if you do this, then, the Russian rhetoric was we're going to ramp up our response and you're going to, we're going to get more aggressive. And then by the summer of 2017, it was clear we were going to give them the missiles. The rhetoric changed and was kind of like, hey, this won't change anything there. We're still going to, continue support for Ukraine. So it was kind of supported the second theory. But if you don't have kind of identify that evidence, what will support which theory, and it's not always that quantitative evidence, right? It's qualitative as well that'll help support a theory.
It sounds to me like you see some drawbacks as well as benefits to the measurement revolution, and maybe you're advocating for a smarter measurement revolution. So making sure that we measure what actually matters.
Correct. It's understanding, right, what if it's a causal relationship and understanding what relationship matters. We run a course and everybody there, here's the terms correlation and causation, and they don't, they're not the same. And in the first 10 minutes, pretty much everybody realizes that they don't understand it as well as they think they did. And it depends on what you're doing, right? If you're a firefighter, then as long as correlation is all that matters, right? If you see smoke, there's probably fire. That doesn't mean the smoke causes the fire, but you can go to you can go there, right? If you want to inspect restaurants, right, then you just might look who has low Yelp ratings, right? Because those are ones typically have more health problems. They're correlated. It doesn't mean the one causes the other necessarily, but that's if you have limited resources in the city of Chicago, then you can go. That's where you're going to apply those limited resources to inspect restaurants. And so it's the same kind of in the defense community. It's trying to figure out what is the relevant metric or metrics that will help you determine that.
How do you inculcate that kind of thinking, not just amongst military professionals, but in general? And then how do you make sure that that kind of thinking is pushed all the way to the top where you have people making the strategic decisions about what to measure?
I think on that, it comes from education and examples of where you've had successes. Because I think fundamentally most people want to do what they write smart policy options. A lot of these aren't necessarily, Republican or Democrat. They're kind of bipartisan, or even if they're right, if partisan, you want to make a good one that's informed on decision. And so I think a good chunk of it is education and getting it inculcated from the start. I mean, another example is when I was at the Modern War Institute at West Point, we would do with some of our cadets, they would do projects. And so one of them was for a civil affairs unit, and they were trying to evaluate measures of effectiveness for their civil affairs units. And too often what we measure is measures of performance, right? How much money, how much are we pushing in here? And when I talked to the unit, I said, well, how do you actually measure if you're effective? And they said they have no idea. Right? So if it's a shorter term project, it's harder to do, right? But if it's going to be a multi-year project, it's thinking from the onset, how do we actually measure if we're effective, right? How do we actually know if we're being effective? And then how do we actually measure that, right? And so you're thinking of it, you're actually doing it somewhat of a controlled experiment. You have limited civil affairs assets. Look for two identical towns that have similar characteristics. You apply the treatment in one. You don't apply the treatment in the other, ideally more than just one, because there could be other things at play. But you do this in kind of over a year cycle or whatever, and you might do public opinion polls or whatever, but have that as part of the project from the onset, thinking about actually true assessments to measure how you're going to be effective before you go and spend that assets. And a lot of that's in the developmental world as well for the State Department. How do we actually measure if we're doing that? We can base it historically. We know some things are going to be more successful than others. But maybe this country you're applying it to is unique in some way that it's not going to be effective.
So the military is going to be conducting large-scale randomized controlled trials with its strategy and tactics.
Well, what you want is you want the strategy, but you want to be able to test it like an experiment.
Gotcha.
So you mentioned, you mentioned this in the article as well, but the need for increased education and training for people in the defense community to better understand, these kinds of understanding what are good metrics, the use of big data, and et cetera. Specifically, you and your colleagues suggest incorporating classes on evidence-based decision-making into different levels of professional military education. And I think the example that you provide with the civil affairs unit and other things that we've seen, recently, but in Vietnam, indicate that this kind of thinking is really valuable at all levels of leadership in the military, whether it be at the tactical platoon level or higher up, with generals at the strategic level. But what exactly would this kind of training and education look like? I mean, are we talking collegiate level classroom statistics classes? Are we looking at in-depth case studies? Are we looking at incorporating these kinds of metrics or this kind of thinking into simulations, war games, joint exercises?
No, I mean, to be a leader, understanding the data, you just have to be able to ask the questions of the analysts to make sure that they're not overlooking something. So you don't have to go to college for, or take a graduate level statistics course. It's great if you have, but you don't need to have that. I mean, we've found pretty good success just with a 2.5 day executive education course. So really, you're just talking a handful of hours, incorporating at the right level, within the professional military education of the military, or the State Department or others. I mean, in a lot of these organizations, the CIA as well, I mean, they all have different kind of professional schooling opportunities, outside of the formal civilian education, and just giving them the tools to understand, okay, what is correlation, what is causation, am I measuring my mission, what are the unintended consequences? For an example we like to use is, okay, you're probably a little too young to remember, but the original Miami Vice back in the 80s, right? So it was based on what it was trying to stop the drug routes in the Caribbean. And it was very effective at stopping the drug routes into the Caribbean. Did it stop drugs coming to the U.S.? Not at all. All they did was move to another area and basically created the land routes through Mexico, right? And so did we really accomplish what we want? If you said, hey, we just want to stop transiting of drugs to the Caribbean, very successful. We want to stop transit of drugs into the U.S., completely unsuccessful, and you could argue it helped probably create the drug cartels that you have there now. And so thinking about those things and not just, your narrow mission, what are you ultimately trying to accomplish, and are you being effective? So kind of providing those kind of examples for them to think about.
Would you say there's a big demand or an appetite for this kind of education or training within the defense community right now? Or is it still kind of completely people don't even realize that this is what is needed?
I'd say probably a mix. I think they don't realize it's needed, or if some do, I think there's still